So open your Bibles to Genesis and chapter 28. I won't be preaching in Vietnamese, don't worry. There's a phrase which sums up the drama of the narrative that we read just now from that chapter. It struck me as I was preparing to speak on this passage in our series, Encounters with God. There it is in verse 16. Surely, says Jacob, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. How could it ever be in life that God is in something, an event, a circumstance, or even as here, an actual place, and yet we appear unaware of it at the time? Somehow surprised by God's presence. You see, it was the discovery of that truth which transformed everything in Jacob's life. Within 24 hours, his life was turned around. And I got to thinking about this. Real encounters with God are always like that. They change us, and for good. And what we're doing on Sunday evenings is reflecting on some of the biblical accounts of those who have encountered God and lived to retell the story, the experience. And perhaps the most interesting aspect of tonight's dramatic episode is that Jacob wasn't looking for an encounter with God. And it happens in a place which was unremarkable and entirely ordinary. Look at the beginning of the story. We're told there in verse 11, when Jacob reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. A certain place. This place hasn't even got a name. That's how insignificant it is. There's not even a goat or a camel there. Nothing but rocks and sand. And yet by verse 17 in the narrative, this on the way to nowhere place gets a name. And what a name. How awesome is this place, says Jacob. This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. The gate of heaven. This unimpressive, out-of-the-way place becomes Bethel, the house of God, the gate of heaven. And the point the narrator wants us to get is that Jacob had no intention of stopping there. It was not the kind of place anyone would. That's why verse 10 is so significant. Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. Now, there are two places with names. So you see, when we find Jacob, he's in between places. In between Beersheba and Haran. Beersheba was where his family were. And it was a place he loved. Jacob was really a hometown boy. He was secure among the tents and flocks of his father Isaac. But he'd left that named place, that known place to him, and he was on his way to the other place called Haran. That was where his mother Rebekah was from. Her brother Laban, Jacob's uncle, of course, well, he was a landowner and a sheep farmer. And that's where Jacob was heading. So you see, he's in between places now, not intending to stop, but having to. And something happens. He encounters God properly for the very first time in his life. Oh, his parents had faith and knew God. And so did his grandparents, Abraham and Sarah, but not Jacob. So in this out-of-the-way wilderness, in this place without a name, this in-between non-place, something crucial happens. It becomes a crucial place because God is present. And when God is present, listen, heaven touches earth. That's the lesson of this interesting episode in the Old Testament. When God is present, the non-place, becomes the crucial place. The most ordinary places become the setting for God's glory and power, for change and significance. Now, I want to return to that theme by way of application towards the end of my message tonight. But before we get there, we need to know why Jacob was in this no man's land in the first place. What brings him to a situation where, alone under the stars at night, he beds down and hasn't even got a tent or a duvet or a roll-up sleeping bag? He even has to use a rock for a pillow. We need to understand that when we pick up the story, Jacob is a man in crisis. He is a man on the run. If you think that the goings-on in Albert Square with the Carters and Alfie and Cat Moon of EastEnders are crazy, then you need to start reading the soap opera that is Jacob's real life. Jacob is the second-born son, only by a few minutes, of Rebekah and Isaac. But he's his mother's favorite. That's because God tells Rebekah while she's pregnant, the younger of your twin boys is going to be served by the older. And from that moment on, Rebekah does her level best to engineer the fulfillment of that oracle. She probably puts Jacob up to his first trick. Jacob becomes a bit of a trickster. Well, maybe Rebekah puts Jacob up to his first trick because there's Esau, his older brother, who loves his food. And there's Jacob, the quiet one who likes to dwell among the tents, studious, the stay-at-home boy. But Jacob makes a wonderful broth for his brother. And when Esau returns from a day of hunting in the fields and smells the stew, the hunger gets the better of him. And he agrees to sell his birthright, that very special birthright in Israelite culture, as the first son and heir of Isaac. He agrees to sell that birthright for the stew. He gives his birthright to Jacob. Now, time passes. And the day comes when, years later, Rebekah hears that Isaac is beginning to make preparations for his death. He's going to pass on his deathbed blessing to Esau. So, Isaac asks Esau, Esau, make me the kind of tasty food I like and bring it to me, that I may give you my blessing before I die. Well, the scheming Rebekah thinks, let me dress Jacob up in animal skin so that he will smell and feel like his big, hairy brother. And Jacob goes along with it. And his mother tells him to go to his blind father and pretend to be Esau. The deception works. Isaac pronounces his blessing not upon Esau, his firstborn, but upon Jacob. And when Esau finds out, he's so furious that he threatens to kill his little brother. In steps the protective mother and tells Jacob, run to your uncle Laban in Haran. Keep your head down for a bit, and when Esau isn't so grumpy, I'll let you know, and you can return home safely. You see that as Jacob falls to sleep that night under the stars, alone, abandoned to the elements, fearful of his brother's anger, living with the guilt of his deceit and broken family relationships, he is a man on the run. But this man on the run encounters the God who is there. There are two parts to the encounter as the narrator tells the story. The first part of the encounter is visual. Jacob says, the text in verse 12, Jacob had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord. The first aspect of this encounter with the God who is there is visual. In a dream, Jacob sees a ladder, more accurately probably a stairway, like one of those ancient Near Eastern ziggurats the sacred temple where a ramp is built into the outsides of the structure from top to bottom, all the way. And on this stairway, angels are going up and coming down. And at the top is the Lord, and the angels are reporting to God. Now, it was widely believed then, as it is across the world today, that dreams are one way in which the gods communicate. Of course, we know that one of Jacob's sons, his favorite, Joseph, was to make a name for himself as an interpreter both of his own dreams and those of the great Pharaoh. And by the way, angels were not creatures with flappy wings, but awesome messengers of God. In the Old Testament, they were believed to be in charge of certain territories on earth and patrolled them on behalf of God. Here, of course, in our story, they are reassuring Jacob that God is present in his broken life. But notice how in the narrative, it is not the angels who speak. God does that. And this gives us the second element of Jacob's dream. Yes, it was visual, but secondly, and most importantly, it was verbal. Other gods may appear, but the God of the Bible speaks. He takes the initiative and speaks to this fraudster, renegade traitor. Can you see what's going on? All the human conflicts and broken relationships in Jacob's life to this point are being challenged and confronted. But they are being given a new focus. In this, the most important relationship of all, the one that he needs to have with God. The waking world of Jacob is a world of fear and terror and unresolved guilt. But Jacob's dream world creates a different, an alternative narrative. Here, you see, is a different future for him from the one he imagined while he was on the run. Here, in his dream world, is a future with hope and security. But it's only different because in this encounter, God speaks. He reminds Jacob of the story so far in verse 13. I am the Lord, the God of your father, Abraham, and the God I will give you and your descendants the land on which you're lying. Jacob, you see, stands in the line of promise, and he's sleeping on the land of promise. The blessing of God was to give that land and a glorious multitude of descendants to make them a nation that would bless others throughout the world. But then the Lord makes promises directly to the fugitive. There they are, all caught up in verse 15. And there are three promises there, really. Here's the first. I am with you. See the text, verse 15? I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. First part of the promise, I am with you. Jacob is not alone. He has more than survival ahead. In that stairway, heaven has touched earth. And Jacob learns that human existence is not in fact bleak and determined, nor the universe silent and meaningless. And in moments of deepest crisis, God is still with us. The fugitive has not been forgotten. God, the God of his fathers, is with him. With him, the displaced refugee on the run. And so we learn, not for the first time or the last time in the Old Testament, that this God identifies with the abandoned, with the orphaned, with the displaced, and with the persecuted. It will be a recurring theme in the history of the people of God. Today, the Christian church across the world carries the same conviction. We speak for those who have no voice. But let's not get drawn into application yet. There's another element in God's promise. I am with you. Secondly, I will keep you. That's the offer of protection. The dream tells the homeboy that wherever he goes, the angels of God will go with him. Jacob is not going to be left to fend for himself and live on his wits. He will have backup. the keeper of Israel, guarantees the lives of those who are exposed and defenseless. But God has a third thing to promise. I will bring you back to this land, he says. I will bring you home, in other words. Now, if you fast forward the soap opera that is Jacob's life, there's 20 more years of intrigue and deception and 2 wives and hard labor ahead of him with his uncle Laban. And eventually his brother will try to hunt him down. But, says God, you will return here. For God is making the promise as he's leaving the land, on his way out. And if God makes the promise of his return as he's leaving, we can be sure that God will certainly bring him back home to the land when his 20-year exile is over at last. A final scene brings this episode to an end. As Jacob wakes from his dream, he feels awe. This is the gate of heaven. And as he rises the next morning, this man who has been on the run, this man who has encountered the God who is there, this man now begins to make promises himself. The man on the run becomes a man with commitments. Early in the next morning, verse 18, Jacob took the stone that he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel. Then Jacob made a vow. He's a man with commitments. His pillow becomes a pillar for worshiping this God he had encountered. He pours out the only thing that he has left with him from his home in his backpack, some oil. But he's serious about God now. He repents and believes. He abandons fear and embraces God's promise. If God will be with me, he says in verse 20, and will watch over me on this journey that I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear so that I return safely to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. You see? He's a man now with commitments. He finally gets it. His undefended sleep has been the gateway for God's presence and power in his life. He's learned a lesson. Heaven has to do with earth. God is with him in the most unlikely places. Of course, Jacob's response is in the real world of time and space. On Monday mornings, his response is not in his dream world, no, but in the real world where his journey has to continue and his fears have to be faced and his family reconciled. But he is determined now to leave this place, which has a name, Bethel. He's determined to leave it as a new man with a new destiny. It's the dream world which shapes Jacob's real world. That is the version of reality he believes. He now believes that God is with him and will keep him and bring him home again to his father's house. Jacob is willing to embrace that new reality. And he vows. He commits to the future. True encounters with God, like this one, always lead to deep commitments, vows, if you like, life-changing decisions. Because vows have that capacity, have that impact. Vows have the important impact of reorientating our life around new convictions and new possibilities. That's why we vow. That's why we commit, because we are now reorientating our thoughts, our hearts, our homes, our lives around this new possibility that God has opened up. Jacob, the trickster, is now bound, life and limb, to this God. Oh, God has been bound to him over many years, since that oracle was first shared with his mother while she was pregnant with him. But now, Jacob is bound. He gets real. He pledges to tithe whatever God gives him materially in the future. He will stand and live and pray on those vows, on those promises that he's making to God. Well, I promised you that I would develop some applications, so let me make good on my vows. The most obvious application of this passage, the one that I think I've been nudging at all the time, is this: God can be encountered in the most unlikely places. That, it seems to me, is the very good news of this story. There is traffic between heaven and earth. Heaven is not a remote place. Heaven has to do with earth. Now that means lots of really exciting things. Here's one, just one. All life is sacred. All life is sacred. We can find the presence and the signature of God anywhere and everywhere. That's what this passage means. Creation is full of the possibilities of God, and Jacob finds that glory among the desert stones and in his dreams. The great scientists of 300 years ago, during the scientific revolution as we call it, they would often speak of two books of God's revelation. The first they called the book of nature. The stars, the sunset, the solar system, all a sacrament to God's being and power. Nothing's small. Earth is crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only those who see take off their shoes. The rest sit round and pluck blackberries. The words of the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Earth is crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God, but only those who see take off their shoes. The rest sit round and pluck blackberries. God can be encountered, you see, in nature, in his creative activity, which means that, friends, nothing is ordinary. And every place can be the gate of heaven. But those scientists of the revolution 300 years ago spoke of another book. The book not of nature, but the book of God's Word, the Bible, from which we particularly learn of God's revelation of himself in Jesus. For there, uniquely, in the life of Jesus of Nazareth, heaven touches earth. In a way that it had not done so before, or has done so ever since. In Jesus, notice, in Jesus, not an angel, but in Jesus, God himself comes down the ladder to live among us. Of course, those of us who have been brought up in a Christian tradition and have heard sermons like this before, and who are familiar with the Bible stories and categories, it may not be something of a surprise that this idea of God coming to earth in the real human life of his Son. But my friends, that was and is an unexpected and unusual place for divine power to be located. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. Molly was reading to us in that lovely Vietnamese tongue from John chapter 1. Why did we read it? Well, John chapter 1 deals with the earliest beginnings of Jesus' relationship with those that he would eventually call disciples. And he begins to gather followers around him. And they are astonished. Philip and Simon Peter and Andrew and this chap called Nathaniel, they are astonished by Jesus' wisdom and authority and the way he reads people and reads situations. And they say, Jesus, how do you do it? How do you do this? And Jesus replies, my friends, you shall see greater things than that. I tell you the truth, you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. What's his point? Jesus is consciously recalling this incident from the life of Jacob. And he's saying to his first followers, I am Bethel. I am the house of God. I am the gate of heaven. Here in me is where you can encounter God. And then, if you know John's Gospel, chapter 1, he performs his first miracle, the turning of the water into wine, and gasps of astonishment are heard among the wedding guests. What is this divine power in the most unlikely place? But that is typical of the God who comes where he's not anticipated, who comes when he is least expected, to transform human reality, just as he did Jacob's, and just as he can ours. Because there, in the non-places of our lives, in the going nowhere fast places, the in-between places, where nothing we think very much ever happens, in that place, God shows up and makes the ordinary extraordinary. You see, the paradox of Bethel is the paradox of the good news itself, of the Christian gospel. Who would have thought that the creator of the universe would be born in a stable and grow up in a carpenter's shop and, listen, die on a cross? Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. The Greeks of the first century looked at the cross and called the whole notion of God dying utter foolishness. How can this place of suffering and abandonment, this place of torture and weakness, how can this broken body, this piece of wood between earth and heaven, be the location for God? Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. And then there's me, and there's you, and there's us, and our broken humanity. How can this body, this fragile humanity, this easily broken life be the place where God by his Spirit lives? How can this restless, self-seeking, insecure person with impossible dreams be the location of the power of God? And yet the book of God's word says you are made in God's image. And you can be remade in Christ. And your life is the temple of the living God, who by his Spirit lives in you. You see, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. So how can we encounter God? I guess I've pointed the way, firstly, to the presence of God in the most unlikely situations and places. And we need to be open to that, open to the possibility of God being there with us in that in-between, going nowhere place. I've also pointed to Christ as the place where we can have the most real and personal and daily encounters with God. But I want to finish by asking the question, okay, if Jesus is the gate of heaven, if Jesus is the place where the angels of God ascend and descend upon him, if that's the way to know God, then how does that happen? Well, we can say an awful lot about that. I just want to say two things. Firstly, a kind of negative. Beware of the danger of relevance in wanting to know God. Relevance can be a real barrier to encountering God in the unlikely places of our lives. What do I mean? Well, let me explain it. Explain it with a story, with a biography. Henry Nouwen was a brilliant academic. He taught psychology and theology at Yale and Harvard universities for 20, 30 years. The fact that you may not have heard of Henry Nouwen is the whole point. Because Nouwen gave up his prestigious position, his reputation as a writer and speaker, because he experienced what he called a deep inner threat. He realized that growing older did not necessarily bring him closer to God. Instead, he felt close to burnout. He concluded that the question of life is not how many people take you seriously, how much are you going to accomplish, can you show some results, but do you know God better? And Henry Nouwen moved away from the temptation to be relevant and on trend, those addictions to success and influence and popularity and power. Instead, he joined a community of people with physical and mental disabilities in a forgotten corner of northern France. And there, Henry Nouwen served and talked to them and washed dishes and organized their schedules. And commenting upon his move from the worldly relevance of teaching at the famous American colleges to the irrelevance of working with the disabled in the L'Arche community, he said this: I wanted to live a life that was not dominated by the desire to be relevant, but was instead safely anchored in the knowledge of God's love. Beware, my friends, the danger of wanting to be relevant. Personal, life-changing, defining encounters with God are more likely to be found in the in-between, out-of-the-way places of life. But let me finish, not with a warning, but with an encouragement. To know God better, to encounter God in his majesty and love, we need to cultivate the importance of stillness. A.W. Tozer was a self-taught Christian leader who became perhaps best known for his book, The Pursuit of God. And when I first read that book as quite a young Christian, one phrase of his stood out among the pages and pages of writing. Was this phrase: we must be still to know, wrote Tozer. And that is something that I am always trying to remember 30 or so years later. We must be still to know. You see, I think that called out to our age of activity and noise and relentless networking. It calls out to the drivenness of the kind of personality which never stops. We must be still to know, to listen, to hear God amidst the busyness and the demands. There is a listening stillness which we all need. Not stopping, so much as active waiting, engaging with God. Tozer describes it as pressing into God for more of him, more intimacy, more vision, more encounter.